My next guest, Manish, I've known for quite a while, has extensive experience both in the traditional advice world and also in the digital. Manish, it'd be great to hear from you as well.
Thanks, Ned. As Ned said, I've kind of grown up in financial advice and wealth management. So I've done everything from the coalface as a paraplanner and financial planner, all the way through to sitting in the C-suite for a financial advice businesses here in Australia. Moved across to a consultancy role, both here and in the US, really helping institutions kind of grapple with some of the changes that Richard's alluded to, and spent the last almost 3 years as the CEO of a fintech looking to build technology solutions to solve these problems. And now spend my time consulting to other partners, both early stage and mature, around how to solve those problems.
Turning to you, I mean, you've been on both sides of it, right? You've seen it from the institutional side as well as from the fintech. What is it that grabs a customer? I mean, I definitely, from Richard's point about values, absolutely. But from the digital way, what is the number one thing that you see?
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to agree wholeheartedly with Richard that, there's a whole raft of problems in the industry. But when you look at the customer, they either want one of two things, and it's always the same. They either know what they want and they just want it at a cheaper price, or they don't know what they need and they want someone to help them make that decision. And advice, as much as we like to talk about advice is just a pathway to an outcome. So what customers are really looking for is someone to help them get to that end outcome. And so the digital gap, digital wealth is just another mechanism for solving that in a more timely, more effective, more efficient mechanism. It's not actually doing something new, it's doing it differently. And that's what I think customers want is, we've all gotten used to picking up our smartphones or jumping online and getting anything we want. So why should financial advice and the broader sense of financial advice, why should it be any different?
You've built these strategies, right? You've actually built them. You've built the technology. And I think maybe, for you to dive into those details, when it's a good question. When Richard asks, what does this question mean? It can mean a lot, right? But like this, there are so many strategies, but how as an institution do they think about it, right? You've been in the institution, but you've also built the tools, right? What's the right way to connect the dots? For people who are listening to this, they want to connect the dots. They work in an institution to the customers. How do they do it?
Well, I think they first have to realize that what financial advice means to, and I like the analogy of, the shiny guys in suits in towers, what it means to them is drastically different to what it means to the average guy on the street that needs financial advice. And so it's recognizing that to start with. And then once again, if you look at the digital gap, and it is huge, it's about breaking that down into the elements that you can actually build a bridge over. And some of them you can and some of them you can't. And it'll be different from organization to organization. And so I think if we turn to Richard's example in question one around, he now shares his top holdings updates on LinkedIn as opposed to publishes it once a month. That's a great way of closing that digital gap for existing investors within his fund. And I think that's really, really smart. And for an investor, they would see that as financial advice. For an institution, they'd see that as portfolio holdings and reporting. And so we need to recognize that. So I think it's about breaking down the problem into small components of problems and then looking at how you place to solve each of those problems, whether it's the document creation, whether it's engagement of customer, whether it's helping through portfolio selection, whatever it is along that spectrum. And that's what I've always found. If you try to solve the whole gap, the whole digital gap at once, then you just end up building a bridge to nowhere.
And maybe just to follow on to that, Manish, is there something that would be surprising? So when a financial institution thinks about using a strategy, there's certain areas they would think about right away that they think, they need maybe automated portfolio. What is the areas perhaps they're not thinking about that you learned?
They never, ever, 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 ever think about their data capability, their own internal data, and how to expose that data. So something as simple as they just forget that the customer thinks that the institution knows them and they need to respect that. And so having to ask someone for their name and date of birth and to re-register on a new system, even though they've been a customer of XYZ Bank for 10 years, that's totally, it's a totally incongruous experience. So I think institutions are really quick to think, what is the best of breed technology that I can buy in to solve this problem? But they never think about where they're starting from in the process. So understanding their current level of digital and data maturity and advice maturity is absolutely critical before you even engage a a solution provider or a consultant or anybody.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I've used this phrase before, but nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, I want to buy a balanced equity portfolio today. Right? It's not how humans work. We wake up and think, hey, I'd like a new house or better retirement, and the balanced equity portfolio is the product that gets us there. Yet I think financial institutions think people want to buy their products. They need their products. And I think it's a great point that
totally.
data,
Yeah, but I think the same is true of the buyer inside of the institution as well, Ned. So you've probably experienced that when people are ready to buy bamboo, they never think of how am I going to point it at the customers that I already know want a balanced equity portfolio. They just assume there's some kind of magical system in there that'll make it work. And people, almost like rats going to the Pied Piper, they'll just find their way to the magic balanced equity portfolio.
I'd love to hear from you, from your point, what really works and what does not work.
I think what doesn't work first and foremost is thinking that you have the answer and building towards that answer. So you need to start with a hypothesis and almost incrementally build, whether you're using existing technology or new. You need to say, look, this is what I think this is what I think investors want, or this is what I think ESG investors want, or whatever the underlying hypothesis is, and then start to build that first piece and build and test and build and test. And so, I've seen firsthand that by taking that model and being flexible around and using things like agile methodology and so on, that you can start to actually get to your answer quickly, but it's not going to be a single jump. It's going to be a series of twists and turns and waypoints before you get there. And some are going to yield you really good and interesting insights, and some are just going to be frustrating and kind of, plow you into walls where you think that should have worked. It works in the traditional sense. It works in real life. We've done it this way for 20 years. Why isn't it working? So I think opening up with I hammer on about it, but opening up with what's the problem to solve and then being flexible about how you solve it is really critical.
So maybe just to come to a summary that we have. So I think we've looked through these three different questions. I maybe would like to ask for one key takeaway from each of you as we wrap up. For the people who've listened to this who are thinking, how am I going to do digital, whether they're at the biggest organization or at a firm that's, let me think, a quarter of the size of Eden, which would be one, because you have four. So what would be that one takeaway from the closing, thinking about the customer? Let's phrase it in this way. If you're thinking about your customer in the digital world, what's the one takeaway people should focus on? Manish, to wrap us up, if you're thinking about digital customer, what's the right thing to do?
Yeah, I might kind of throw a view on how institutions should think about this. And, I'd say what they need to do is start by thinking about the customer problem, not their own problem. So don't walk into a room and start thinking about what's broken in our business. Start by, what can we do better, or what can we do differently for our end customer? And, there'll be times where that's got a good link with what's happening today, and other times where you're literally building, a rocket ship to the moon. Probably the other thing is to look for examples that have occurred in other markets and other areas outside of financial services, because, we're not alone here. If Rupert Murdoch woke up 30 years ago and said, well, people are going to stop reading the paper once a day and start reading it 35 times a day, he might have done something differently really, really quickly and really early on. He might have started selling, stories on a 20 cent per story basis as opposed to buy the paper. So I think, there's always examples, and you've got to look through the context and find the actual insight there. But there's plenty of them, and we're on a well-trodden path. We're not first, and we're definitely not last. So it's just looking for those real world examples and taking what we can out of them and applying them to today.
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase, to look outside just of the industry itself. I recently rewatched Steve Jobs' Here's to the Crazy Ones, where that famous advert he had that had nothing to do with computers, had everything to do with people outside, but how they were affecting their lives and how it should be impacted.